Sunday, March 4, 2018. This is Mercedes Diesel Guy, and this is my 1983 Mercedes 240 Diesel. The car's been parked here in the garage pretty much since August. I've been driving my Volvo. I spent between 2012 and 2015 about 3.5 years putting the car together, and the one thing I sort of took a chance on while building the car was the front suspension. I figured, okay, the car's got high miles. The front suspension must have had some attention to keep the car on the road. And because I figured the front suspension on a car really takes a beating. So I just kind of took a chance on that. I mean, I redid everything in the rear, and it turns out I made a bad call on that. In the time I was driving the car, the front suspension just really never felt as firm and connected to the road as it should be. And I know how it should be because we've had these cars in my family since 1980. And I got my first 123 body Mercedes in 1996. So I've been driving these cars on and off now for 22 years. I know how they're supposed to feel. This one always felt kind of vague and wandering, and there was a kind of a disconcerting clunk in the front end when I would come to a stop sometimes. So fast forward to August of 2017, and the car kind of suddenly felt and drove a lot worse. So something really needed attention, and I didn't have time to deal with it, so I parked the car in the garage and have been driving my Volvo since. Finally, I have gotten around to working on the front suspension, and I've basically decided to do pretty much everything. Now that's pretty much all the bushings and the upper control arms, and more or less I'm gonna do you a walkthrough of all of that. Not a complete detail to take it apart and put it back together. This is going to be kind of a long video anyway, so I really don't want to make the intro too long. But basically what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you the necessary steps for disassembly. I'm going to give you, at that point, the torque for reassembly, and if necessary, I'll show you the procedures for replacing specific items. I think this car's really big problem was the ball joints, upper and lower up front. So I've already done the passenger side of the car, and I didn't want to do a video until I knew what I was doing. So I've already done the job once, and I'm going to do the job again on the driver's side of the car, which should basically be the mirror image of the other side. The only things I'm really not going to tackle are things I've already done, you know, whatever, several years ago. I mean, I will be showing you shock absorber removal and reinstallation, but I'm not going to show you any of the, even though I did replace the shocks a few years ago, which is my point, but I'm not going to show you anything on the steering, because none of my, all my steering stuff is brand new. I've only put a few thousand miles on the car since I built it, and I'm not replacing any of those items. So this is really just a front suspension rebuild, not the steering. So before I ramble on and on, the first thing you need to do is jack the car up and support it on jack stands properly. And if you have the rear wheels on the ground, which I do, make absolutely sure you've got your parking brake on and you have the wheels chalked. I can't stress that enough. You do not want the car rolling on you. So I've already got the car supported. So the next thing I'm going to do is take off the front wheel, and really I'm not going to show you how to do that, but give me a moment to do that, then I'll show you what to do next. Next, the brake caliper has to come off, and I really am trying to do my best on lighting here. So in order for the brake caliper to come off, the pads have to come out, you have to disconnect the sensors. So let me disconnect the sensors first. These are brake wear sensors, and I just disconnect them right here. Hope you can see that, just very gently working the sensors here out. Don't want to break the wires. Okay, it's one and then the other. And then I'm not sure you have to, but I find it's a good idea just to release the this portion of the sensor from the brake caliper, and in my case there's a 10mm bolt here on the back side of it, and I don't have a torque available for that, but it's a small bolt, just to be sensible when reinstalling that. So I'm going to remove this and take the this portion of the sensor off. So I just get behind here with a 10mm wrench and remove the bolt. And if you're worried about losing the bolt, just thread it back here into the caliper. Okay, next, the brake pads have to come out. Now I can't get the camera behind here to show you, but there's two pins holding the pads into the caliper. So you need to get a punch on here and here with a hammer to start driving out those pins. So let me grab a punch and I'll do that. So here's the punch. Then you pull the pins out, pull the spring out, and then you pull the pads straight out of the caliper. Once again, I've got a pair of 19mm bolts here on the back of the caliper. Can't really show you those, so I'm going to release those bolts, remove them, and hang the caliper out of the way. And once you have these out, if you're going to reuse them, it might be a good idea to mark them inner and outer, just so you know which they are for reinstallation. Now, the brake pads and everything here is pretty recent. I know you see a lot of flash rust here on the rotor, but that's just because the car's been sitting in the garage. I'm not at all worried about that, so I'm going to mark these and then continue on. So forgive the noise, neighbor's toddler in the background. So I'm going to take off the brake caliper now and hang it out of the way on the sway bar. Now, I'm going to be replacing the, just fast forwarding here, but I'm going to be replacing the sway bar to upper control arm bushings, but not the sway bar to body bushings under the hood, because in order to do that I'd have to take out the brake booster, and that is a lot more trouble than I think it's worth. I'm just going to take a chance on those bushings being okay. Hopefully that won't be a bad decision. So, basically there are two 19mm bolts here on the back of the caliper that have to come out. I've got my socket and my breaker bar, and when you reinstall those go to 84 foot-pounds. So I'm just going to use my breaker bar here and loosen the bolts and take them out and then hang the caliper out of the way. Next, you're going to want to take the brake disc off. Now, in order to do that, you need to knock off the dust cap here. And then underneath the dust cap, you need to release this lock nut here, which is covered in grease. So give me just a second. There is a little hex bolt there. If you want to put this back together without repacking the bearings with fresh grease, I would suggest you work carefully and cleanly and bag everything, which is what I'm going to do. And then once you have that off, the caliper will pull straight off the steering knuckle here. Just be careful that you don't lose the outer wheel bearing in the process, which I can see is already starting to come out. That's all there is to that. I'm just going to bag everything and clean it up here before I move on. So I'm moving on now, and I'm going to remove the shock absorber on this side of the car. And I start here under the hood, and the exact hardware may vary between different brands of shock absorber. So I'm not going to get into too much detail here, but you can see the two nuts at the top. Now the top one essentially locks down the bottom one. So I'm going to hold the bottom and loosen the top. And then before I go any further, I'm going to get a jack under the control arm there, because once you release the top of the shock here, the control arm will drop down a bit. And propping up the control arm will make it just a little easier to get the shock absorber out, at least at the top here. So give me a moment to put the jack in, then I'll continue on here. And before you remove this bottom nut, you need to hold this shaft steady so it doesn't spin. And it is flat here at the top, so I just like to get a little wrench on there. In this case, it's just an adjustable wrench that I have handy. So now that I have the control arm supported, I'm going to remove this nut. And once you have the second nut removed, you can remove this washer and this bushing. And once you have all this top hardware off, you need to move down into the wheel well. Okay, so I'm here in the wheel well, and this is the shock. Now, I had to go handheld on the camera to be able to show you this, but there's two bolts at the bottom, one here and one on the opposite side here. So I found that the best way to remove those bolts is actually to pull the shock out of the way, because it will pivot a bit at the bottom. So, as you remember, I put a floor jack underneath the control arm, so I'm going to remove that now, which helps give me some more clearance here. Then I just grip the shock here at the top, compress it a bit, and depending on the condition of your shocks, this may be easier or more difficult. Now my shocks are almost brand new, so it's not the easiest thing in the world. So I am now going to remove the two bolts at the bottom here and then just pull the shock absorber out of the way. And to give myself a little more clearance on the outer bolt here, I'm actually going to also remove the brake dust shield, which is only held on by these three bolts right here. And for reinstallation, the torque I'm finding for the lower shock bolts is 15 foot-pounds, and I can't seem to find any torque specs for the hardware at the top, so you know, just use your best judgment when tightening those down. So I'm going to remove this now. And once those bolts are out of the way, you can pull the shock absorber out of the wheel well. Next, the spring has to come out, and that's quite a bit of a procedure, so I am going to now move up to the engine compartment again. And once again, before we move on, those lower shock bolts, once again, 15 foot-pounds. Now, this next step only applies if you're using a clone of the factory tool, like I'm going to be using. Now, before I show you exactly how it works, I'm just going to give you a brief description of the tool. Now, you can't use a standard spring compressor on these, because these are very heavy-duty springs and it's unsafe to do so. So you don't want the kind of spring compressor that clamps to the outside of the spring. Some people have reported using those with various success, but I wouldn't. And there are other people out there who have found ways of removing these front springs without using any version of the factory tool at all, and I'm not even going to go into that. I'm not even going to try that. The clone tools are not expensive, but the thing is with the clone of the factory tool is that you need to enlarge this hole right here, because the tool is essentially three pieces. There's a shaft that goes down in the center of the spring, and then there's two compressor plates which you insert into the spring through the wheel well. So like I said, you need to enlarge this hole here, and I found that the easiest way to do that is a Dremel type tool with like a tungsten carbide bit. And this is the set I have right here. Now, I actually got hold it up to the camera here. I got these I don't remember, it was either eBay or Amazon. They weren't expensive. I just went for a set of 10. And despite all the metal grinding I've already done with just the one bit I've used, I can't find a scratch on it. So let me get the tool set up and I'll show you. Okay, so here's the tool I'm going to be using. This is my old Black & Demer Dremel clone. It's always worked well for me. This here, of course, is the tungsten carbide tip on here. So essentially, you want to go down here and just enlarge the hole a bit, and just have the tool, the spring compressor shaft handy. So, you know, once you've ground out a little bit, you just test to see whether or not the shaft will fit through this hole. And with a tungsten carbide bit, I would say it shouldn't take you too long, maybe 10-15 minutes max to enlarge this hole. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. Okay, so 10 to 15 was quite a bit of an overestimate. It just took me a few minutes to do this. You really shouldn't need to take away a lot of material. Now, I know these clone tools are, from what I hear, they're not all created even, but once again, you just insert it down there, and now I have enough clearance to get this part in and out. So what you need to do next is put the spring compressor plates in place. Here they are. Now these two pieces are not identical. One of them here has bigger notches, and this one has smaller notches. It is the plate with the wider holes that needs to go on the bottom, and you can see that because here are the notches that the spring compressor shaft needs to lock into. And as you can see, the top plate doesn't have quite the same thing. So this one here with the wider notches goes on the bottom. So I'm going to reinsert these and continue on from there. Put the spring plate in and then shift it into position as needed. So let me show you these in position. Now, one issue with the spring plates on these clone tools is that they are a bit thicker than on the factory tool. Now that does make it a bit more difficult to insert these and use them, but what I'm going to do is actually put a little bit of grease on here. Put the spring plate in and then shift it into position as needed. So let me show you these in position. So I have the lower spring plate here and the upper one here, and you really want them as far up and down as you can get in order to be able to compress this spring. So now once that's in place, you drop the spring compressor shaft through the center here, and then what you need to do is make sure that these 3 tabs here on the tool lock into the bottom plate, and then you tighten it all up, and that compresses the spring, and you can get it out of the car. So let me get this all set up and then I will compress the spring. So once again, I'm going handheld with the camera for a moment, and once you have those spring compressor plates in place, you start feeding through the spring compressor shaft. So I'm going to put the camera down, just go 2 hands with this, make sure it feeds through both plates. So as you can see, I have the spring compressor plates in place, and I have the shaft running down the center there. And basically, once you have the shaft fed through the bottom plate, you're going to have to look in there probably with a flashlight and make sure that the shaft is properly engaging the bottom plate. Now this will all be fairly obvious once you have the tool and you've played around with it for a few minutes, but just be careful. You do need that to interlock properly. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go up to the engine compartment again, and now that I'm working in the engine compartment, I start cranking down the spring using just using a ratchet. Now there are warnings on the tool not to use any impact tools on this, and there's really no reason to. Honestly, with this tool in place, it shouldn't take more than a few minutes to compress the spring. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to get this started, then I'm going to go down to the wheel well one more time and make sure that the spring compressor shaft really is properly interlocking with that bottom plate before I put any more tension on it. So I'm going to start cranking this down. Okay, I'm just going to go down and check the wheel well and make sure that the compressor shaft is properly interlocking that bottom plate. Okay, everything does seem to be going well. I got another look at the bottom plate there. The compressor shaft does seem to be properly interlocking both plates, so I'm going to keep cranking this down. And like I said, it shouldn't take more than a few minutes to get this cranked. Okay, and once you have that cranked down all the way, you should then be able to remove the spring. And I believe I should be able to do this now. Once again, you want to be very, very careful with the springs in this car, as they are under extreme tension. And once you get it out of the car, just get it out of the way. Now, going under the car here, next, I like to loosen the lower control arm to body bolt, which is right here. And if you can see here, I've made a few paint marks around because this is an eccentric bolt. Next, I'm going to pop loose this upper ball joint. And this nut here is 17 millimeters, or at least it is on my car. And here is the separator tool I'm going to be using. So I'm just going to leave this on for now just to loosely hold this together, and when you install the nut, when you're done with the job, and in my case I'm going to be replacing the upper control arm, this will be tightened down to 30 foot-pounds. Next, I'm going to use the same method to separate the tie rod here, and once again, since I replaced all the steering components, you know, probably about 5,000 miles ago, I'm not going to be touching those. So, you know, first I loosen this nut, then I'm going to pop this free. And this nut I actually will remove now to separate the tie rod from the steering knuckle. Okay, so we have loosened the upper ball joint. We have separated the tie rod from the steering knuckle. And we have loosened this eccentric bolt right here. Now, the only other thing you really need to do at this point is, because I'm going to be taking everything out pretty much as one unit, is you need to remove the 3 bolts holding the guide rod to the body. Now, I'm showing you the front side here with these 3 bolts, and you can only see the bottom 2 here. These are the these are the shank of the bolts. Now the heads of the bolts are on the other side. It's just easy to show you here. So once you've located your guide rod mount, just go around to the opposite side here and remove those 3 bolts. This shouldn't be in all that tight, and when you reinstall this, that should be 26 foot-pounds, and I believe some blue thread locker on them. So I'm going to remove those bolts from the other side, and then I'll show you what to do next. Now that I have the guide rod mount loose from the body, I'm going to remove the lower control arm eccentric bolt. And now that I've actually removed the lower control arm bolt, which I had loosened previously, all I need to do is just remove this upper ball joint nut here completely, and then I can take the steering knuckle, lower control arm, and guide rod out as one unit, and I find it easier to work with all of that when they're all out in one piece. So, just to be careful here, I'm going to put a jack stand under the control arm so the whole thing just doesn't come crashing completely to the ground. And as you can see, the jack stand caught everything, so all I need to do is get the jack stand out of the way. And this all comes out of the car in one piece. Okay, I just broke free the upper control arm bolt here, and I thought I was filming it, but I wasn't. But I'm not going to remove it completely yet. But this is the next thing I do, and when I reinstall everything with the new control arm and the new bushings here, this is going to go to 48 foot-pounds. So now I'm going to move up to the engine compartment and remove the bolt holding the upper control arm to the body. Okay, now this here on the inner fender, near to where the upper part of the shock absorber mounts, this here is the upper control arm to body bolt. Now, I actually had tremendous difficulty with this on the other side of the car. Not removing the nut, but actually getting the bolt out, because the bolts, for some reason, at least according to other people I've talked to online and from my experience on the other side of the car, these do tend to seize up inside the upper control arm. So maybe I'll get lucky and this will come out easy. The nut should come off pretty easy, but actually getting the bolt out may prove a little difficult. So let me remove the nut and go from there. Okay, now I loosened the nut. Just going to remove it by hand. And then let's see how easily this bolt comes out. Can't push it out by hand, but let's see if a little persuasion with a hammer will help. Okay, very easy for me on this side of the car. You may have tremendous difficulty with these bolts, but you know, don't lose hope. You'll get it out. So I'm just going to use a punch to tap this the rest of the way out. See if I can grab the rest of it by hand before it falls. And there you are. Upper control arm bolt out. Just in case, I'm not planning to replace this one, but it would be a very good idea just preemptively to have new bolts on hand. And sorry. And then when you do install the new bolt or reinstall the old one and tighten it, this goes to 63 foot-pounds. Now, I can remove the upper control arm to sway bar bolt. And then I need to pull off this outer bushing here. And once again, I am replacing these all with new parts, new bushings, new upper control arms, so I'm not worried about damaging anything. It's always a good idea when you're doing this much work just to replace everything. So now the upper control arm should be free. And you can see, came right out. Okay, so you can see I have the steering knuckle, the control arm, and the guide rod out pretty much all in one piece. Now, I'm going to start replacing parts. First thing I need to do, actually, is remove the lower spring plate here. And if I'm not mistaken, these are just 13 millimeter bolts, nothing special. Yep, 13 millimeters, so I'm going to take those off. And I have not been able to locate a proper torque spec for those, so I'm just going to be sensible when I tighten them back down. So I'm going to remove those. Next, I want to take this lower arm here off the steering knuckle, and there are these two bolts here at the bottom. I believe they are 19 millimeter. They are. And if I recall correctly, I think the torque on those is 65 foot-pounds. Next, I'm going to remove this nut securing the ball joint to the control arm here. Now this is 22 millimeters, at least on mine, and when you install everything with, once again, a new ball joint, that should be 59 foot-pounds. So let's see if I can zip this off quickly. I would be confident in guessing that this was a good portion of the problem as to the clunking and the way the car was driving. So basically what I need to do now is support this and then hammer the ball joint out from this side. Now I'm going to be placing an impact socket on here and using a big hammer to drive it out. That's what I did on the other side of the car. It actually worked pretty well. So you just need to find a way to support this. I've seen one guy with a video where he actually buried this side here in the ground, and I actually have kind of rigged up a stand to support this, but it's really a makeshift thing that nobody should be copying. So I'm going to drive that out, and then I will show you putting in a new one. See, that wasn't too bad. I got that out with some heat, a little bit of penetrating oil, and a 4-pound sledge. So once again, here is the old ball joint, and I took the boot off, but you can see that's gone. That's beyond gone. You can see it's already rusty as hell inside, which means this got compromised a long time ago. So moving on from here. Okay, so here's the part where I'm going to be pressing in the new ball joint. Of course, here is the new one. And here is the steering knuckle, and the old ball joint is out, and it's all cleaned up and ready to receive the new one. Now, there is a special factory tool to install the ball joint. It is very hard to come by and very expensive, but you can actually do this with a rental tool from your local auto parts store. Now, this here is the big C-clamp tool I actually borrowed / rented from the local AutoZone, and you can probably get something similar there or at a similar store. So the thing is, though, this tool is not properly ideal and set up for the job, so you need to make an adapter. And I'll show you how this all goes together in a moment, but here's what I came up with. This here is actually a piece of pipe. I want to say it was 2 inches, and I cut off just as much as I needed there. And this here is a big washer, and I'll show you how this all works, but basically this will be the adapter piece to use this tool with the ball joint. And here is one of the pieces from the ball joint press kit. So the first thing I'm actually going to need to do is get the rubber boot off the new ball joint, because that's the only way I'm going to be able to make this work and go in. So when I take this off, obviously I'm going to have to be careful not to get any dirt in the grease, and if you go the same route, you're going to have to be careful too. So I'm going to get that off, and then I'll show you how to set the tool up here. Okay, so I have the tool all set up and ready to go here. Now, I'll just show you how I have this set up. It's probably not the easiest thing to see on film here, but obviously I have the clamp in place. And here, this is an adapter piece that came with the kit. This goes on the bottom. The ball joint is obviously in place here, as is my homemade adapter, and it really shouldn't be too hard to come up with something yourself. The thing is, with the homemade adapter, what you want to be doing is pressing all the weight from the clamp on the flange here of the ball joint, and not on the ball joint itself. This way you won't damage it driving it in. So I'm just gonna make double sure that I have this all lined up correctly. It looks like I can looks like I do need to make a slight correction here. It's a little off center. And then I'm just going to hit the screw here on the end of this with an impact gun, and that should drive this all in. It's actually not too bad a job to do this with the borrowed/rented tools. So I'm going to drive this in, and I'll pop the rubber boot back onto the ball joint. Okay, I'm going to give this a try here with the impact gun. Okay, I'm just going to take this off, make sure everything is centered and everything, but you can see I have it driven in at least most of the way at this point, and I will make any further adjustments if need be, but all in all, that just took a minute. Really wasn't too bad a job. And as you can see, the new ball joint is pressed in and ready for service, and the boot is back on. Okay, and just for reference, this is the tool set I borrowed. Borrowed this from AutoZone. It is Powerbuilt, model number 648617. And just give me a second, I'll open it up and I'll show you what pieces I actually used. Okay, so most of this kit I didn't even touch at all. I really just used the C-clamp piece, the screw piece, and this adapter piece right here to drive in the ball joint. So, I mean, the rest of this here is completely unnecessary, but you know, this heavy-duty tool with my electric impact gun made short work of the job. So, moving on. And now to deal with the remainder of the control arm and guide rod. Now, what I'm going to be doing is replacing the control arm bushings here, and I will basically show you how I'm doing that. And I'm also replacing the guide rod mount right here. This is the guide rod, this is the guide rod to body mount. And on the passenger side of the car, although I did replace it with a new one, it did seem very solid. Now, this one here does seem unusually floppy, so I do believe this is worn out. And I'm going to put a new one in. Once again, probably also contributing to all the front end problems I've had. So, basically, in order to remove the guide rod from the control arm, which is what I'm going to do right now, it's just a 19mm bolt through here with a 19mm nut on the other side. So I am going to go ahead and remove that. And as for the torque spec on that bolt, basically I saw two numbers. Now, one of them is for a 10mm bolt, and one of them is for a 12mm bolt. For a 10mm bolt, supposedly it's 52 foot-pounds, and if you have a 12mm bolt going through there, it's 78 foot-pounds. Okay, now that I have the guide rod separated from the control arm, I'm going to replace the guide rod mount here. You can see I have a brand new one, which really just is nice and stiff and does not flop around like this one. So, there really is just a clamp here with a 13mm bolt and a 13mm nut. And once you release that clamp, you can unscrew this. Now, the thing you have to keep in mind is you really need to be mindful of the overall length. And so I'm going to be doing two things here.
I'm going to be making some very careful measurements of the whole length of the guide rod itself to the end of the mount, because you can see here that these two pieces do not look identical. So, like I said, I'm going to be doing two things: measuring the overall length, and I'm going to be measuring the number of turns it takes to release this from the guide rod itself. So once I have those measurements, it's really just a matter of putting the new one in and setting it to the same length. And I don't believe I'm going to get it 100% perfect. And of course I am taking the car in for an alignment, as should you. But this should hopefully get you within the ballpark. Okay, that didn't take me more than a few minutes. I have this new piece on. I measured everything, and although I did insert the first thing I did was I installed the new one the same number of turns at which I removed the old one, and then I measured and the length didn't quite measure up, so I adjusted it, and hopefully it's within the right ballpark. Like I said, I'm going to take the car in for an alignment. They should adjust everything, so I'm really not too worried about it. This is really mostly just to get me to the alignment shop. So next, I'm going to go back to the control arm, which you see here, and I'm going to be replacing the control arm bushings here. And in order to get the old one out, essentially, I have to grind off this little inner collar here, the center of this metal piece. And then once that's out, this center piece will drive out and I can remove the bushings. I'm going to grind it out with the same tungsten carbide tip I had used on my Dremel tool. And once that is out, I can remove the bushings, and I'll show you how to press in the new ones. And then one more thing I wanted to show you. You can see I've made paint marks here where the tabs on the bushings align to the control arm itself. And I believe these tabs are meaningful in their orientation. I could be wrong, but I will simply set up the new ones to match this. Okay, before I go any further, I just wanted to show you the setup I'm using here. This is a piece of threaded rod. Got a few thick washers on either end against the new bushings. Here are the new bushings. I have them loosely lined up with the paint marks I made. And on the other end here, I have a few nuts stacked up so this end won't move. So basically what I'm going to do is just tighten this nut here against the threaded rod, and that will bring the bushings in here. And obviously as I'm going, I'm going to make sure that they line up with these paint marks. And once this is all together, I'll show you the final step here in installing this bushing. And also I just wanted to show you that the rubber part of the bushings themselves, I have put a light coating of this stuff on it. Once again, this is called Sil Glide, and this is a lubricating compound. I find it good for installing rubber bushings, and it actually does not damage rubber. So I've just gotten this started by hand. I'm going to go as far as I can by hand. Then I'm going to get a wrench on here and bring these bushings in. Okay, I'm going to try to keep this on camera as best I can, but not having much success there. But this is really going pretty easy pressing these in. So once again, that's my recommendation. Piece of threaded rod, some nuts and washers. Get creative, don't go nuts. Should be pretty easy to get these in. And then once you have the new bushings pressed in place and aligned with the marks you made, you take this aluminum sleeve here and you press it all the way through. And if you give me a second, I'm going to have to put down the camera in order to do that. So once you have this sleeve inserted as far as you can through the one side, you can see it protruding on the other side here. And what I do to lock it in place is I take a tapered socket, put it on the end there, secure the other side, and then hit the socket. And what that does is it'll just spread this out and lock these in place. Not that these are really going to go anywhere once this is bolted into the car, but this is just something you have to do here. So I am going to, like I said, just hit that with a tapered socket with the other side supported, and then the new bushings will be in and installed. And then once that's all done, what I like to do is reassemble the steering knuckle to the guide rod to the control arm. Okay, the front suspension is now rebuilt and have everything reassembled and ready to go. Now, I don't remember exactly when I started this project. I want to say it was early February, and right now it is Saturday, April 7, so I have not yet gone into editing this video. I did not show reassembly because, as I said, reassembly is essentially the reverse of disassembly. So, there's really not too much I can give you in the way of helpful hints, except for one thing. If you just give me a second to get in closer to the wheel well for a second. Okay, so you can see I have the spring back in place here. And in order to refit the spring, which of course was still compressed at the time, I had to make sure that this top ball joint was not connected, because with everything connected I could not jam the spring into place. So basically I got the spring into place here, still compressed, and once it was loosely just laid in place, then I finally tightened this top ball joint here. What else? For the lower control arm bolt, which is, right there, what I did to tighten it was I actually put a jack under the control arm and basically lifted the control arm up as high as I could with my jack. So in theory, that should properly tighten the bolt. Now pretty much the next stop with this car is going to be for an alignment, which it will probably desperately need. And other than that, it's almost ready to go. Now, the Mercedes here has been off the road since, I want to say, late August. I drove it once, maybe late September, to take the car in for inspection, and it did pass, but the suspension was feeling pretty scary at that point, which is why I stopped driving it. So there's a few more things I want to do before I put it on the road for the spring. I want to give the car an oil change. I'm also going to be replacing the motor mounts, but probably not going to do a video on that. So basically, this is done. I look forward to driving this car without a clunking front end. Hopefully, because I replaced all the parts with brand new ones, it shouldn't be a problem anymore. So this is Mercedes Diesel Guy. Thanks for watching. Like I said, I did not show reassembly because it's essentially the reverse of taking everything apart. And I hope I gave you all the torque specs and all the information you need. This is not an easy job, and it's not a job for a beginner. And you really do need, in terms of proper tools, at least the spring compressor. Absolutely do not screw around with any alternate methods of trying to remove that spring. It is just not worth your safety. Even the clone spring compressor tool like I have is not expensive, and it is absolutely worth the money. If you don't want to buy one, see if you can rent or borrow one, but absolutely have the proper kind of tool for that. Other than that, I showed you how to do the ball joint with the AutoZone tool and a homemade adapter. But other than that, it's all pretty standard hand tools for this job. So this is Mercedes Diesel Guy. Thanks for watching. If you have any questions, please post them in the comments, and I will be happy to try to answer them. Thanks for watching.